Of all the Cron children, George appeared to hold the most promise. Well-educated, charismatic, energetic, George seemed to be the apple of his mother and father's eyes. But as many of us in this room have learned, our lives are made up of a series of decisions. Some are made for us, others are made by us. Those decisions shape us and mold us. They set us on paths that we could not or would not foresee. George's adult life appears, at first glance, to be an unending series of poor decisions in which he was somehow constantly surprised by the unfavorable outcomes. My aim today is to explore George Cron and his tenacious companion, Serena Livingston. I will focus heavily, but not only, on their journeys in Louisiana, namely George's purchase of a sugarcane plantation. More specifically, asking how did this decision forever change the course of his life, Serena's, their children's. But before we move forward, I acknowledge that each of us comes with our own unique life experiences, which informs the way we perceive different topics. Some of the topics discussed here today are emotional and potentially psychologically triggering. They include child loss, slavery, the ideology of white supremacy, race-based violence, addiction such as gambling and alcohol, self-harm, and suicide. Should you wish to step away or leave at any time, please know that you are free to do so. Indulge me in a brief biographical background for the new members of the audience who may not be acquainted with our young George. George was born in the late fall of 1791, exactly 11 days before George Washington's first cabinet meeting and 1 month before Articles 3 through 12 of the Bill of Rights were ratified. He was born the same year as Alexander Hamilton's brainchild, the Bank of the U.S., though they were never destined to become the best of friends. His parents, 39-year-old William Cron and 26-year-old Lucy Clark Cron, George was their second son, only 18 months younger than his older brother John. His earliest memories were likely of constant preparation for the continuing stream of younger siblings his family would welcome. Memories of the hustle and bustle and constant movement of the family members in the house and the enslaved workers on the farm resembling a human beehive. Frequent visits to Louisville with his father would have shown him a world reflecting a frontier lifestyle, but accompanied by rapid economic growth and social change. In the first years of the 1800s, Louisville was an adolescent frontier town, though its strategic location on the Ohio River destined it for greatness in both transportation and trade. The economy was in its infancy, still dependent on agriculture, but quickly shifting to trade and the movement of goods. Housing improved steadily from log cabins to brick buildings, which included emblems of a growing community like churches, courthouses, and universities, many of which his father was a patron. While this paints a scenic portrait of George's early life, we cannot forget the many pockmarks on the face of this budding nation. Travel was arduous, the limited roads being little more than dirt paths. Medical knowledge was limited, and more often than not based on spiritual quackery rather than scientific evidence. But the largest scar was the existence and acceptance of slavery, the turning of a blind eye to oppression for the comfort of the enslavers. Slavery was an everyday presence for George, one that he witnessed not just on his trips to the city of Louisville, where he likely saw the auctions of enslaved men's and women's bodies, but also at home. His mother and father were subtly and sometimes overtly educating their children on what it meant to enslave other human beings. George received his earliest educational instruction in the fields of the farm and in the great parlor of Locust Grove before attending Dr. James Priestley's Academy in Danville, Kentucky in 1806. In the fall of 1808, George and his cousin, Richard Clough Anderson Jr., departed for college at the illustrious Virginia University, William and Mary. This exploration of Williamsburg and the nearby metropolis of Richmond and major trading port of Alexandria broadened his geographical and social horizons. George excelled academically, but his strength was in verbal communication. His commencement oration discussing expatriation was given on the 4th of July, 1811, and was described as concise, ingenious, and argumentative. His chosen topic on the anniversary of the nation's independence was likely inspired by the story of his father, the Irish expat and revolutionary patriot, Major William Cron. Overall, George's early life was one of transformation, both his own and that of the world around him. From adolescence in a small frontier settlement turned bustling river city to his early adulthood in one of the country's oldest universities near the nation's largest metropolis. His formative years witnessed the establishment of government, America's first presidents, the formation of political parties, for better or worse, the fervor of territorial expansion, and unique advancements in transportation and culture. George, no longer a child, was now seeking his way in the world. He was briefly enamored with the possibilities of studying law. However, war was in the air and was in his blood as well. The westward expansion of American settlers into indigenous land increased tensions among settlers and tribes. The opposition of indigenous leaders, such as Shawnee Chief Tecumseh in the 1809 Treaty of Fort Wayne, further fueled animosities, leading to bloody skirmishes and raids between settlers and indigenous nations. Indiana governor and future president of the United States, William Henry Harrison, had grown concerned about the increasing strength of Tecumseh's Confederation and decided to take military action. George Cron, alongside his cousins John O'Fallon and J.R. Bothby, were among the Kentucky Volunteer Dragoons joining Harrison's campaign in 1811, displaying their earliest military talents at the Battle of Tippecanoe. George must have been quite impressive, as he won public notice from his ranking officers, while his cousins did not. He was soon appointed aide-de-camp to General Boyd, the second in command, which led to his later appointment as young 20-year-old captain of the 17th U.S. Infantry, responsible for the management and movement of over 200 men. Showcasing his valor in the War of 1812, he was elevated in rank to lieutenant colonel and earned the moniker Hero of Fort Stephenson at age 21. During this time, George also served under another future president, an important character in this story, General Andrew Jackson. Cron and Jackson first became acquainted at the tail end of the Battle of New Orleans, George arriving in New Orleans with his militia just as the bloodshed was ending. Again, George's undeniable charm was at the forefront. He and Jackson quickly became close friends and social allies. George's foot was now in the door of some very influential spaces, both militarily and politically. Through Andrew Jackson, George was introduced to Edward Livingston. You see him on the left. Edward Livingston, once a lawyer in New York alongside Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Livingston was also U.S. Attorney and Mayor of New York City until 1803, when he relocated to New Orleans in 1804 and opened a large and lucrative law practice. During the War of 1812, he assisted Jackson as his aide-de-camp, and during Jackson's later presidency, was his Secretary of State. But here at Locust Grove, we know Edward as the uncle of George Cron's future bride, Serena Livingston. Serena had a family that was as large as it was powerful. Her father, John R. Livingston, was a wealthy landowner in Manhattan. Her other uncle, Robert Livingston, was nicknamed the Chancellor, as he was famous for many things. He administered the oath of office to George Washington and acted as minister to France and negotiated the Louisiana Purchase with Bonaparte. So how did Kentucky's boy major and son of Irish import William Cron land a young aristocrat from one of New York's most prominent families? A family connected to the Van Rensselaers, the Schuylers, the Astors. Serena was the object of the deepest romantic yearnings of author Washington Irving, of Rip Van Winkle and Legend of Sleepy Hollow fame, and Henry Black Horse Harry Lee. I always stumble on his nickname. Still, no one thought themselves worthy of Serena's beauty and charm. As Washington Irving wrote in March of 1816, Serena is the heroine of all my poetical thoughts, where they would picture anything very feminine and lovely. But where is the hero of romance worthy to bear away so peerless a face? Not among the worthy young traders of New York, most certainly. It's difficult to tell if Irving approved of Serena's later choice of husband, as his next recorded mention of her in his correspondence could be read in either complete seriousness or complete sarcasm. The marriage of Serena Livingston is in the best style of modern romance. I hope the Colonel is as amiable in the parlor as he is gallant in the field. If so, he is the very man for her. I should not have liked to hear of her marrying some commonplace counting house gentleman. He really loved bankers, didn't he? George was introduced to Serena in the early fall of 1816. He was in New York, having lobbied to be a member of the court-martial trial of General Edmund P. Gaines, whom George blamed for his infantry's disastrous defeat at Mackinac Island. A ball was held in Albany in honor of the soldiers of the late war, and it is likely that George and Serena were both in attendance. George may have even volunteered news of her uncle in New Orleans as a self-introduction. Regardless of how or when George and Serena met, their courtship was brief. Their marriage was celebrated in the spring of 1817 at the Chapel of St. John's in New York, with William and Lucy in attendance. Also among the attendees were George's military friends, including future brother-in-law Thomas Jessup, another major player in the story, who was also a witness in the Gaines court-martial trial. George and Serena's early years of marriage were blissful and romantic. It was likely this bliss, and perhaps even the request of his young bride, that inspired George's quick retreat from nomadic military life. From this point, the story becomes muddied and bittersweet, quite literally. George was eager to bring Serena to Kentucky. By June 1817, they made the month-long journey from New York to Louisville, with the final leg by steamboat. Here, George immediately set out in search of an appropriate home for his new bride. His decision to retire from the military to start his family seemed logical. Back in Kentucky and near to his family, George could start his life as a gentleman planter, resting easily on his future inheritance as well as Serena's. This is where things start to take a confusing turn. Late summer of 1817, George writes to Edward Livingston, and I have abridged it. I have been advised by some of my friends to dispose of my lands in this country, and with the proceeds, establish myself as a sugar planter in the neighborhood of New Orleans. The proposal which I now make, to take upon myself the personal management of one of your plantations for a certain proportion of the profits. In addition to my own personal attention, I could increase your present force by the addition of 25 or 30 valuable enslaved laborers. You could be asking several reasonable questions at this point. Why did he want to leave Kentucky so soon after he arrived? What properties did he have in Louisville at this time? Who was he going to sell them to? Where was he going to purchase the enslaved workforce for this plantation? However, I believe another important question is who are the friends advising him to make this decision? This seems like a wholly illogical course of action. To this point, George has never lived on his own, much less run his own farm. Let's recognize the sheer gumption he's displaying here. This was either madness or brilliance. Additionally, George had never cultivated sugar, which was an incredibly difficult crop to cultivate and even more labor-intensive to harvest and process in the early 19th century. Sugar cane required a 12 or more month growing season to reach full maturity. Louisiana provided a 10-month growing season, even in its southernmost regions. Depending on where the property is located and what the seasons were like, if the first frost or freeze came too early, the sucrose in the cane would diminish and sour, rendering the crop next to worthless. While the properties in the newly acquired territory were cheap, there were reasons for that. Many of them could only be reached by water, traveling on the Mississippi and the western bayous. Many were composed of Pleistocene terraces, which meant that the soil had poor organic composition for this crop. It was not just rotten luck he had, but the crop itself rotted in the field. Additionally, the infrastructure required for a sugar plantation was massive and required a lot of startup capital. Where was George's capital going to come from? The answer is found in his father's account books. In William Cron's ledgers, we see an intriguing period of banking activity that discloses the source. Between April 1817 and March 1818, George's father reinvests a $3,000 deposit every 60 days, and on November 30th, invested $5,000, all in connection with notes in favor of George Cron. On November 10th, 1818, Cron entered, "To my note payable in 60 days, $10,000 to his son George." $10,000 in 1818 is equivalent to just over $200,000 today. Quite a starting fund. George and Serena visited her family in New York once more before moving to their newly acquired property in Louisiana. Her cousin Louis wrote her Uncle Edward after their visit. "Serena is now with her husband on her way to Louisville, both perfectly happy. I hope they may continue so. The Colonel cannot fail to do so with such a woman, and Serena can wish for nothing as long as she is with a man whom she looks upon almost as a demigod." I love that quote. Quite telling about their current state of affairs, don't you think? Still completely in love and ready to embark on their next chapter. Serena, perhaps even still ignorant of the fact, was pregnant with their first child, and William and Lucy's first grandchild. Sometime in the late fall or early months of winter, Serena gave birth. Their elation was quickly abbreviated into the torment of parents with ailing children. Their son took ill at some point within his first months. His cousin, Anne Thruston, wrote to her half-brother, "Colonel Cron has been very unfortunate in losing his son. He brought his child, which was then very sick, to papa's the early part of the winter to be more convenient to the doctor. It lingered 3 weeks and died the poorest little object I've ever beheld. They set out last Monday for New Orleans." Their baby died before he was 6 months old, the first tragedy the young couple encountered together. After their son's burial, they took some time to grieve, then they once again made their plans and started for Louisiana. The journey from Louisville to New Orleans on a steamboat took between 2 to 3 weeks if conditions were good. If the weather was poor or the waterways low, it could take over a month. They were expected to be there by the end of February at least, as Serena's father, John R. Livingston, writes to his brother Edward, "Colonel Cron and Serena are, I hope, arrived ere this. They're setting out in life, and I regret much that the Colonel chose such a distant place for his commencement. But he was so full of making a fortune in a few years, and seemed so certain of it, that I could not help acquiescing in his plans." We've heard of people being described as full of emotion, whimsy, life, hot air, surprises, enthusiasm, or even full of themselves. Perhaps George was full of all of these things, but John R. and Edward Livingston both knew that while fortunes are easily squandered, they're not easily made. Building their life in Louisiana was no easy task. The startup funds they received from Major Cron only went so far. George and Serena sold lots they owned in New York City to raise funds to build their new sugar houses needed on the plantation. The first official document confirming George and Serena's land ownership in Louisiana is from 1820. The enumerator for the federal census traveled from plantation to plantation in the parish of St. John the Baptist and ultimately found Colonel Cron, though Serena is notably absent from the enumerator's tick marks. This record shows the startling truth. There are 33 men, women, and children enslaved by George on his sugar plantation. The question of where he purchased the additional enslaved individuals for his plantation is answered in a letter written by Edward Livingston only a few months prior. Colonel and Serena are here. He is about selling his enslaved laborers and going on next month to buy others in Virginia. The practice of trafficking enslaved individuals to and from Virginia was common, and it was something that he witnessed members of his own family participate in throughout his life. This confirmation of George's active participation in the trafficking of enslaved men and women informs us just how active William and Lucy were as enslavers and parents. George knew what to do, where to go, and how to get there. By now, it's probable that he had begun to learn just how brutal the labor was for enslaved men and women on his sugar plantation. As Serena's cousin Louis wrote in 1816 in reference to his father Edward, To derive any great profit from the cultivation of the cane requires a person insensible to the sufferings of others, who can turn a deafened ear to the sighs and groans of his miserable slaves, and even silence them by the application of his lash. A quote that belongs in every school textbook. George and Serena's property was known locally as the Cron Plantation. It rested just above present-day Garyville, Louisiana, directly adjacent to what's now a Marathon oil refinery. No record exists detailing the type of residence or buildings that were there, but we can guess. Early sugar plantations in Louisiana were made up of a main house of at least 1.5 to 2 stories, usually at least 2 rooms deep, 2 rooms wide, and a central hall with end-to-end chimneys. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In addition to the main residence, sugar plantations also required anywhere between 20 to 25 dwellings for enslaved laborers, and at least 1, if not more, sugar houses for the processing of and storing of sugar and rum. Like other plantations in the U.S., they required stables for animals, kitchens, wash houses, privies, and more. George's early years as a planter were a family affair. William Jr. assisted him in the early breaking of land and transfer of horses and oxen. His brother-in-law, George Hancock, also assisted in the management and planning, and possibly accompanying him when he was in Virginia selling and purchasing enslaved laborers. Edward Livingston continually checked in and described his niece Serena as in excellent health, and George as being an excellent and laborious planter, so much so that the plantation began to take up all of George's time and thoughts. In October of 1821, he wrote his younger brother, William Jr., I have of late scarce given a thought to any subject not appertaining to my plantation, which in truth has and does yet require my undivided attention. I find now that I undertook too much at the commencement of the season. To make 500,000 bricks, tend 200 acres of cane and corn, cut 700 cords of wood, make hay, etc., is no easy task for 30 hands, half women, for 1 season. He continues that his only comfort is that he should make twice the amount of sugar next year. Sugar, once processed, is packed into hogshead barrels which hold about 63 gallons of sugar each. His hope was to produce 150 hogsheads that season. With the work on his land and the construction of cabins and sugar houses, George valued his property at over $100,000, or today's $2.3 million. Could this be accurate or reflect only George's wishful thinking? It would be incredible to be able to see the actual accounts. The following 2 years welcomed more labor, more expenditures, and more children. The Cron family expanded with the arrival of Mary Angelica in late 1819 and another baby boy named Charles in 1821. Charles also succumbed to illness within his first months. In July of 1822, George and Serena visited the Livingstons in Red Hook, where Serena, newly pregnant, decided to stay for an elongated visit while George returned to New Orleans for the 6th season. St. George Cron was born the following spring in 1823 and lived to adulthood. It was no secret that Serena did not like New Orleans. Setting aside the spoiled persona Serena has long been saddled with, there was a lot to dislike. The long distance from both of their families left her with no village. The climate was not healthy, particularly for her young children. Travel was difficult and exhausting. The rich social life she once had in New York and Albany was non-existent. It was not what she thought she was getting into when she married a decorated war hero and man about town in New York and Washington. Things take a sharp turn. George's plantation debts start to come due. His profits are not sufficient to cover them. Immediately after his father's death in 1822, George sells off some of the tracts of lands he had inherited to pay his mounting debts. After only a few short years, George's sugary sweet dreams were turning sour. His property was swampy and hard to cultivate. The weather was unseasonably cool, and the crops continued to fail. The crop prices were fluctuating wildly, so no one could judge how financially successful the season would be. George put all of his eggs in a swampy basket. The weather turned his farmer's life into that of a gambler and speculator. Perhaps that's what drew him to it. He was completely dependent upon chance, and an evil turn of the cards, a bad season or fall in prices, exposed him to ruin. After 2 seasons swept with rain and sharp frost that froze and destroyed the sucrose-rich juice within the canes, George decided to cut his losses. He bet black, but the roulette wheel hit red, just like his ledgers. Things become so bad that in 1823, it is Serena that suffers great embarrassment and mortification on George's account. Kaitlyn Bell wrote, "Poor Mrs. Cron, what mortification she must have endured previous to her leaving here. There is scarcely one solitary being in the whole neighborhood that George does not owe, and she, poor unfortunate little woman, was tormented every moment. She had the mortification to endure of selling herself the little furniture of her very bedchamber to meet his debts. I'm told she was almost heartbroken. They were obligated to leave in the night. The sheriff was within a few acres, with the intention of seizing his person when the boat pulled off. George and Serena, with young children in tow, fled the sheriff and made their way to Louisville for safety and solace. George writes several letters to his advisors, his in-laws, John R. and Edward Livingston, his sister's aunt's husband, General Thomas Jessup, and his younger brother, William Jr. He tucks Serena and their children away in New York with her father and immediately turns to work attempting to settle his affairs. While his letters are on their way, George begins to scramble to salvage his source of income and public name. In early 1823, John Livingston learns of the pending sale of George's property to Mr. Robert Bell and his wife, Caroline Butler Bell. The sale included 15 acres of residential land and 150 acres of tended sugarcane fields, 25 enslaved laborers, 25 horses, 5 cows, and what was described as the best sugar house in the state. Caroline and her brothers Edward Butler and Anthony Butler were also the legal wards of none other than George's old friend, Andy Jackson. Young Anthony writes to his older brother Edward, "I'm residing with Mr. Bell, who has recently purchased the establishment of Colonel Cron, who has so far fallen short of success in his affairs here as to have been obliged to dispose of his property and leave the country in embarrassment. Poor fellow!" My goodness. Poor Mr. and Mrs. Cron. His failure in business is ascribed to various causes by different persons. Some think it owing to the extravagances and excesses of his life. Others attribute it to the sudden and unexpected depreciation of the value of property. But I myself am inclined to believe that it arose from a certain negligence and looseness which appears to have run through his affairs. The successful sale of his land would have been a huge boon in George's time of financial crisis, but the sale fell through. At some point during George's financial nosedive, he rolled the dice and took out a $62,000 loan, $1.4 million today, from the New York Life and Fire Insurance Company. There is discussions that could be had on the ethicality of this company extending a loan to him when he had so much debt and no visible means of repayment. As his debt continues to go unpaid, a lien was placed on his property, meaning it was no longer his to actually sell. And yet, Robert and Caroline Bell still take up residence on the property with the hope that George can salvage the deal. When they arrived at the plantation, the whole property was in a wretched state, the sugar house unfinished, and the land neglected. The horses could scarcely walk from starvation. When the previous New Orleans postmaster announced his resignation, Jessup and Jackson saw an easy way to keep George in a lucrative income, and George was grateful to both men. He wrote of his relief to Jessup, "I despair of ever doing more as a planter. I'm consequently, as you may suppose, anxious to obtain some appointment sufficiently lucrative for the support of my family. My present crop may be 200,000 pounds of sugar, but the price will be so low and the expenses of the estate so heavy that little can be reckoned as clear gain." George's family was not thrilled with the announcement of his new position as postmaster. John was flabbergasted and hurt that George had never written him on the subject. John had advised him instead to apply for the appointment of the collector of the port in New York. While it may not have been as financially lucrative, it was more suited to George's strengths and Serena's desire to be nearer her family and social circles. George begins his fresh start at the post office full of hope and enthusiasm, but still weighed down by the chains of his debt. His daily work now resembled that of a secretary rather than a soldier. He inventoried post office property and mail on hand. He managed his clerks and mail carriers and maintained the office's usual business hours, which was every day except Sunday. He even assisted customers in mailing their letters and calculating their postage. For his work, he received $2,000 per year, roughly $57,000 now, and his family lived in New Orleans' townhome provided by the post office. Their other properties in Louisville and New Orleans were rented for additional income. While George was great with people, he was bad with detailed accounting. His quarterly reports were typically written by his chief clerk, Nathaniel Chamberlain, but when Chamberlain took ill, George had to fill in as accountant and bookkeeper. Hold that in your minds. By the fall of 1825, only 1 year into his new position, George had grown bored and started to hunt for more exciting possibilities. He set his sights high on the position of adjutant general, but settled for an appointment as one of Jackson's 2 inspector generals. This allowed him to maintain his previous military rank of colonel, position he held the remainder of his life. The duty of an inspector general was to make yearly tours of the posts maintained by the Army, drafting detailed reports, memorandums, and suggestions for improvement. These military outposts were small, isolated stations and were considered the stabilizing and protective force in the western United States, the part of the country that his uncles, William and George Rogers Clark, were responsible for. George was quite excited for this appointment and to be back amongst his brothers in arms. His reports were thorough, detailed, and valuable. While it has never been remarked upon in the biographies of his brother-in-law, Brigadier General and Quartermaster of the Army, General Thomas Sidney Jessup, George's reports were heavily copied to the point of plagiarism by Jessup, who then benefited from the resulting praise. George made his inspection tours in the summer months between June and October, while Serena and the children stayed with family, either in D.C., New York, or their rented townhome in Philadelphia. Tension spiked in August of 1826. Recall that sick post office clerk Chamberlain and George's poor bookkeeping skills. The family is now made aware of its single greatest embarrassment. George either willfully embezzled or woefully mismanaged post office funds to the tune of over $11,000. They hastily attempt to raise funds to meet the debt, particularly his younger brother William Jr. He writes, "I'm greatly distressed on hearing from George that he will fall short in his settlements with the post office establishment. As to the extent of his defalcation, which means the act of misappropriating or misusing funds, he has left me completely in the dark. If the amount is within reason, I will sacrifice my own property to square his account and save him the disgrace of his family. I fear, though, the amount is large and he will be ruined." Between the lands that William sold to assist George and the lands George inherited from his brother Nicholas and quickly liquidated, George was able to somewhat settle the debts with the post office. But he still continually ended up in the red. His financial crises compounded as the New York Life and Fire Company abruptly collapsed during the financial panic of 1826. The bank's president, Henry Eckford, along with several others, were charged with defrauding 7 banks, 2 insurance companies, and scores of private citizens, George Cron included, out of stocks, shares, and cash. The company had $1.2 million in notes coming due, but only $350,000 in assets. The result? A run on the banks, and the New York Life and Fire goes under. George had mortgaged his Louisiana and Louisville properties through New York Life and Fire and proceeded to borrow money from any friends and family he could charm. He was the traveling Bank of George. While he was not on tour, he visited New York to meet with the moneyed men of the city, as well as an attorney named Mr. Sullivan for a chancery suit. Things were so bleak that on November 9th of 1826, Lucy sold Serena 2 properties in downtown Louisville. These properties were both on Main and Fifth Streets and generated highly lucrative rental incomes. One was the Exchange Coffee House, a popular social gathering place. The other, the rented home of the U.S. Branch Bank. Lucy has given Serena an annual income that can support both Serena and her children, but only if Serena can maintain their control. The constant financial strains, the fear of new creditors coming calling, the ever-present anxiety of social ruin, and even the sense of failure towards his wife and family took a heavy toll on George and Serena. George was no longer the demigod Serena once perceived. Serena took charge of her children's care and her own well-being in a whole new way, and George sank deeper. Historians have long struggled, and let me assure you, we still do, to contextualize mental illness, self-harm, and suicide. I'll spare you my own psychoanalysis, though please know that with my knowledge of George and his family, his life, I have many of my own thoughts and conjectures. On November 29, 1826, the first official news reports announced the attempted suicide by George Cron 5 days prior. Over the next 2 months, there were several more printed articles in Pennsylvania, D.C., New York, and Virginia, and Kentucky. The family, with the extreme generosity of famous Philadelphian James Biddle, quickly took control of the news reports. His self-harm was described as fever-induced hysteria. Cron arrived in this city on Friday, the 24th of November, extremely unwell. Immediately on his arrival here, he sent for a physician, by whose direction he was copiously bled. But it proved ineffectual, and at about midnight, in a temporary paroxysm of delirium, altogether produced by fever, he inflicted several severe wounds on his person. The moment his fever subsided, his mind was restored to its customary tranquility and energy, and we're happy to add it is confidently expected that he will soon resume the discharge of the duties of his responsible and important appointment. When Serena had the time and emotional fortitude, she knew it was time to write Lucy. She sat down at her writing table, found her ink, and wrote her mother-in-law the week after the incident. His physicians, Dr. Philip Singh Physic and Dr. Thomas T. Hewson, were attending him, though were it not for the wounds on his arms, he would be perfectly well, she wrote. George continued to adhere to the advice given to him by his in-laws. He sent small payments to his creditors, continued his work as Inspector General, and his family sells off valuable tracts of land to help keep George and Serena above water. The largest purchaser was in fact Anne's husband, Thomas Jessup, who collected 2,300 acres. Once again, George is saved by his family, but still his situation is only half resolved and his family's purses are empty. John and William Jr. immediately began to write anyone that it was them or their father's estate in an effort to build their accounts back up. In July of 1827, George is back on tour as Inspector General, known to have performed his job well, with reports well written and always on time. And the New York Life and Fire Insurance Company, again, who George's mortgages were through, turned out to be heavily indebted to New York merchant and banker Jacob Barker. Barker happened to be trying to take control over the U.S. Bank. So there was a question as to whether George's Louisiana properties would divert to his ownership or remain with Cron. The following threads of the legal cases between New York Life and Fire, Henry Eckford, and Jacob Barker, your head spins, and there's no firm resolution. After George's death in 1849, you still find his name attached to plat maps for his Louisiana land parcel. As both George and his son, St. George, died without written wills, I have not been able to follow the legal land and money trail. While George's brothers were spending their fortunes pulling him out of financial ruin, George fell back into habits of intemperance. Reports began to circulate that when George was on his inspections, his tours turned into months-long drinking binges and gambling in an attempt to hit big and solve his financial woes. In one account, he boarded a steamboat, borrowed $100 from a stranger, and promptly lost it all in a hand of cards. After hearing these reports, his younger brother Charles wrote, "Considering the great solicitude, the great uneasiness that we have had on his account, if this report be true, I think he deserves to forfeit the respect of the family." For someone that has Clark blood running in their veins, that is a huge statement. I think it's important to note how charming George Cron must have been, even as he aged. He must have had such a way with people that he was either able to persuade them or pacify them. Perhaps it was a false echo of his uncle George Rogers Clark's skill as a communicator and negotiator. Whenever George fell into these behaviors, the family's response was to return him to Locust Grove, where he could be surrounded by family, work on the farm, and remained distanced from the fast-paced city life of New York, New Orleans, and Washington, D.C. While his respites in Kentucky were successful, when George returned to work, his willpower was weak. Older brother John became George's crutch and keeper, accompanying him on his inspection tour in 1830. After the deaths of his brother Charles and his sister Eliza in 1832 and 3 respectively, George struggles with staying on the straight and narrow. But nothing unmoors him like the loss of his mother Lucy in April of 1838. He wrote, "I have been out today for the first time since the receipt of the distressing news of the death of the best of mothers. I feel more than you all her loss, for I have, in addition to our common griefs, the agonizing reflection that I alone of all her children have by my repeated misconduct caused her anguish and distress. She is gone, and I cannot offer her the fond assurance that my ways are changed." His desire to improve may have been sincere, but his ability could not follow through. Just 1 month later, John was already hearing rumors of George's intemperate behavior. John commiserates with Serena and agonizes over all that he's already done for his troubled brother. He says, "To confer favors of any kind on him while his actions prove so unworthy of them is an injury both to myself and him. What George does with the money he gets, I cannot divine." I think he knew what he was doing with it. His habitual drunkenness caused him to double draw his pay on more than one occasion, and after discovery, his payments were being withheld to cover the debt. The family, no longer financially equipped to save George, began to fracture. In 1842, Serena had finally had enough. George was listed as an insolvent debtor in Washington, D.C. newspapers. He was bankrupt. She remained in their Philadelphia townhome at number 29 Girard Avenue while George relocated back to Locust Grove, living with John and assisting him on the farm and overseeing the construction of his new hotel at Mammoth Cave. George's 1842 diary reads like a man unmoored. He attempts to read the Bible each day. He joins a temperance society. He reports on his work assisting John. The following year, his Washington City home and all its furnishings were listed at auction. The residence on G Street between 19th and 20th, just a few blocks from Anne and Thomas Jessup, was full of the fine furnishings you would expect from the upper echelon. Mahogany hair-seat sofas, Brussels carpeting, a pianoforte, very large gilt mirrors. Their family carriage was listed among the items for sale. While it may be likely that George may have attempted at some sort of reconciliation, Serena held no interest. In January of 1845, with the assistance of her brother, John R. Livingston Jr., Serena filed a formal indenture of separation. At the time of their separation, their children, Mary Angelica, St. George, and Serena, nicknamed Teeny, were 26, 22, and 12, respectively. The indenture of separation not only allowed Serena to formally live apart from George, but prevented him from having any access or claim to Serena's possessions, financial or material. Remember those properties in Louisville that she's getting rents from. George was also required to pay John R. Livingston $2,000 alimony for Serena per year in monthly installments. I think Serena knew not to hold her breath. George's final years included one last hurrah of military service. In the fall of 1846, he was 55 years old and volunteered in Monterey, fighting under his childhood friend Zachary Taylor in the Mexican War. His stint was short-lived as he fell ill with a disease resembling either dysentery or a severe case of malaria, losing over 20 pounds within just 2 weeks. George died of a disease resembling cholera on January 8, 1849, the 34th anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans. The sad fact is, he also died 3 days prior to his older brother John, whose will would have left a literally mammoth estate to him. But would this truly have solved his problems? I've been struggling with how to conclude this lecture for the better part of 2 weeks now. The perplexities of viewing George's life as a series of decisions that led him to insolvency, marital separation, and ruin became too melancholy. Instead of focusing on the outcomes of his decisions, we have the advantage in hindsight to see George for what he was in his moment, a charismatic dreamer full of hope and whimsy, and probably at times a little too much whiskey. Thank you.
Did his wife inherit any of that money that was supposedly left to him?
Whose wife?
Well, she was separated from him.
All right, so the question was, did Serena inherit any of the lands or money that was left to George? Technically, no. At this time in history, wives are under a system called femme covert, which means that they are legally the property of their husbands. So anything that they obtain could legally go directly to their husbands, which is why Lucy directly selling Serena those lands in Louisville was a really unique deal, and it showed that Lucy and or John or Jessup probably had a conversation with George at some point saying, you do not get to have any right to these or their incomes, but we don't have anything that proves that, but it's just my intuition telling me that.
So where did the money go?
George's money was, so he got all of his money from his father, and probably some from John R. Livingston, and it goes directly into the infrastructure of his plantation. There were still suits against George when he fled the sheriff for workmen that had never been paid. So it's likely that he sunk a lot of costs into extravagant furnishings for his home. Then he realized, oh wait, building these sugar houses is going to cost a whole lot of money. Purchasing enslaved individuals cost a whole lot of money. So he's sinking it into this plantation. Then he takes out that loan. When that goes under, he's now paying back the Bank of the United States. But then he embezzles money from the post office. He has to start to pay back. Then he double draws on pay for his work as Inspector General. So he has to pay that back. So he's moving this money around, and he's taking out loans to cover debts, and then he can't pay back those loans. So he's just kind of spreading all of his debt around. And we always forget, interest gets you. A lot of his loans were at least 10% interest, if not more. Yeah. All right, I see one in the back, and then I'll come to you. Yes, ma'am.
So he was willed quite a bit of land.
Mm-hmm.
However, he was not willed Locust Grove.
Correct.
And that was...
He would have been willed Locust Grove had he not died prior to John. John died 3 days after George, and he, in his will, left Locust Grove to George, but because George had already passed, it reverts directly to St. George. So, George's son. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I was wondering if some of the money that he inherited went to pay his debts.
Almost immediately every time. At the death of his father, he immediately liquidates land to pay off debts. At the death of Nicholas, he immediately, because Nicholas willed him lands, he immediately liquidates that land to pay off debts. And at the death of Charles, he immediately sells that land to pay off debts every time. And so Jessup is like starting to just keep accruing to the point where he has 9,000 acres in Todd County that was originally Major Braun's. And then that's why Jessup gets in financial trouble, because he is helping George pay off all of these debts by buying this land, but he's not able to adequately manage it while he's also being quartermaster general of the army. So he's not profiting off of it, to the point where Jessup is so ready to write George off and kind of excommunicate him from the family because his and Anne's daughters aren't able to go to the fancy schools that they wanted. Following these paper trails has been very intense because there's a lot. Jessup saved anything that had to do with George and money. He was smart to do so, but it means there's a lot of papers to shuffle through to try and piece this together. Yes, ma'am.
Shirley, thank you for the clarity of the breakdown of the Cron family after William and Lucy. So basically, Locust Grove went to the eldest son, which is typical of farms.
Yes.
No matter what your income level, the eldest son was?
St. George.
St. George was his name?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that left them, the man we're talking about, needing to seek his fortune.
Who? I'm not following.
Serena
Serena.
and her husband, which
George.
Okay, who's the oldest son of the family?
John.
John, so Locust Grove went to John then, did it?
Mhm.
Okay.
Well, first it went to William Jr. There's more to this story. When Major Cron dies, the home goes to William Jr. William lives here for a few years. He suffers some really devastating losses. He moves to Pittsburgh. He sells the home to his brother-in-law, George Hancock, who lives here until shortly after the death of his wife, Eliza Cron Hancock. George Hancock then sells it to John. So it kind of,
Okay.
it's a little bumpy.
But as second son, George needed to seek his fortune somewhere. Is there reason to believe his family was among the people encouraging him to go to Louisiana?
No, I don't think that's
Where did that
possible.
come from, do you think?
Your guess is as good as mine.
I
I would bet that it came from either Jackson or Zachary Taylor, both of whom had lands there and had connections there, but I can't be sure. Just because John was the eldest son doesn't mean that George and the other sons weren't going to be given anything in William's will. All of the children get a huge financial sum from their father. He does spread it out quite fairly for the time period. He did omit George from the will in a lot of ways because he had already given him so much money for his Louisiana property before his death. Yes, Jeannie in the back.
Where are you finding all of this information? Where are the many places that you have to go for all of this?
Oh, what a great question. Jeannie asked, where did I find all of this information, all of these documents? It is a long answer because it is everywhere. It's all over the country. Serena, after her separation from George, after his death, she moves out to San Francisco, so there is a great deal of records of her and her children in the Huntington Library in California. A huge amount came from the Jessup collection at the Library of Congress. There's also some Cron papers at the University of Michigan Clements Library. There's papers in Chicago. William Cron's account books and some letters are at the Chicago Library. The Livingston papers are at the Princeton Library. There are papers in the New York Public Library. I have had my fingers in all these digital pots for months now, and I've emailed so many archivists that I'm sure they're tired of hearing from me. Yes?
Just a comment. Serena's house in San Francisco is a historic place to visit.
Yes, Serena's property in San Francisco, her home there is still on the National Register of Historic Places today.
What's the name of it?
The name? I don't think it has a name. It's still a private residence. It's just on the register as a historic structure.
So when he died, she was in New York, and then she went to San Francisco?
She went all over. They were globetrotters. This family, I kid you not, spent probably at least 60% of their year either in a carriage or on a steamboat. They were all over. Are you asking when he died where she was?
No. When they were separated.
Right.
And then was she in New York at the time? Did she go back to New York?
She was still living in Philadelphia to our knowledge, but then she moves from Philadelphia, lives with her family in New York for a little while, and that's when they moved to California.
She did all right.
She did all right for herself.
So why did she have relatives in California or what?
Nope.
Did she remarry?
Nope. Why would she?
So she just moved to California?
She just went to California. That's why I called her tenacious. Yes, in the back there was a question.
Am I correct in synopsizing all this to say that the Livingston they had the wherewithal to jump in and pay George's debt, but it sounds like that they helped with networking of jobs and such, but they didn't help with canceling the debt.
Correct. They were not going, they had started them out. Serena was expected to get a huge inheritance at the death of her father. Fortunately for her, her father lived a very long life, so George could never get his fingers on it. And that's why John Jr. was essentially the writer of her indenture of separation, and he took on her coverture, again meaning that she now belongs to him. Women, I know, I get it. I'm second on my mortgage, I understand. So her family helped keep their name out of the paper. Her family helped with the connections toward his appointments as postmaster and inspector general, and they helped him get his congressional medal in 1835. So they kind of helped in other ways, but they were smart enough to not sink their fortune into a sinking ship. He was a bottomless pit, he was. He loved cards, he loved whiskey. The only thing we don't have a single record of is infidelity, so I'll give him that. I'm sorry? How did their kids do? Mary Angelica, she married well and lived a very long life. They stayed in New York. Serena stayed in California. She married a military man there and lived a long life.
What was her nickname again?
Teeny.
Teeny?
I know, I love it.
Cute.
And their son, St. George, he's worthy of his own lecture. He joins the Confederate Army in the Civil War, and he dies being gut shot on a porch in West Virginia. And his last words were reported in a news article to have been, "I chose the wrong side." I mean, hey, do we have any other questions? All right, one from Ronnie.
In all your research leading up to this, what was something that you learned that really surprised you or maybe even a misconception?
Ooh, I got it. Yeah. Banking and money is all made up. That is what I learned. All of this was made up as they went. And it's the men in power would make the rules that benefited them. And if you knew somebody who knew somebody, you could bend those rules or write a new one.
It's still that way.
It is still that way. Money is not real. That's what I learned. That and the steamboat travel from New York to Louisiana. I learned a lot about those waterways, and that was really something. So I had a lot of fun digging into different aspects of this for sure. All right. Thank you.